Well, welcome back. And now that we've covered in-depth interviewing, it's time to tackle our next qualitative technique, ethnography. If you somehow found these videos through YouTube, my name is Sean Jordan. I'm a professional marketing researcher, and this is the first part of our fourth lecture series for a class on qualitative research for marketing researchers. In our previous lecture series, we talked about how qualitative research is like a light in the darkness, helping to define and make sense of the shapes and shadows that we see in the distance. We also talked about how there are four basic applications of qualitative research. That's exploration, deep dives, idea generation, and testing. In this series, we're going to talk about a technique that generates a tremendous amount of deep, rich data, which isn't used very often as a method of primary research because it's so time-consuming and expensive. And yet, when you read articles about qualitative research, you'll often find that the best and most interesting case studies include this method because it really does make for some interesting storytelling. This technique is called ethnography, and it's a method of research derived from the field of anthropology with a sociological twist. It's also sort of a hybrid of observational research and in-depth interviewing, though it really does have its own set of rules and practices that really differentiate it from those methods. But before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about something that happened to me when I was growing up. Something that I realized much later on in life, and which helped me to make sense of ethnography. So, I grew up on an Air Force base, and here's a picture of the Air Force base where I grew up. And what I mean when I say I grew up on an Air Force base was my father was actually in the Air Force, and I actually lived on a military base in the middle of Ohio. So it wasn't in a foreign country or anywhere weird. It was just in the middle of Ohio. And, you know, for a lot of kids that grew up in this military lifestyle, they actually did get to live all over the world, but not me. I got to live in the South and the Midwest, and we eventually settled in the St. Louis area near Scott Air Force Base. But this Air Force Base where I lived is near Dayton, Ohio, and I lived there for 6 years. I was 5 years old when we moved onto this base. I was 10 years old when we moved off. And in the neighborhood where we lived, which actually you can't see in this picture because it isn't there anymore, but in the neighborhood, there were probably about 100 identical houses. And every one of these houses was a duplex. And the only thing that really differentiated where you lived was whether you lived on the right side or the left side of the duplex. Because in the duplex, there was a middle wall that was a dividing line, and the houses on either side were mirror images of each other. And as a kid, I was actually really fascinated with the fact that everybody in my neighborhood had an identical house. Now, I'd lived off base before. I'd lived in other houses, but you know, I was just beginning to understand the world at this point. And it was so strange to me that even though we all had identical houses, everybody lived a little bit differently. And the reasons that we lived differently had a lot to do with the context of who we were. For example, in the military, it's very common to have folks who, maybe the father is in the Air Force and his wife comes from another country. A lot of fathers who were stationed in Germany or Okinawa, Japan, or in the Philippines or in the Middle East would come back with wives. And this is in the 1980s, by the way. So in the 1980s, it was usually men coming back with wives, but they would come back with wives that were from another culture. And those wives would often bring with them their cultural understanding and would decorate their homes accordingly. So their kids would be infused with this culture around their houses. They would have all these really interesting cultural artifacts. It made their houses stand out in a way that, you know, for a kid like me whose parents were both American, we had a much more traditional house. There was also a real sense of hierarchy. In the military, there are ranks. And there are really three classes of ranks. There are what are called the enlisted folks, which are airmen, sergeants, staff sergeants, tech sergeants, master sergeants. And then there are the junior officers, which was what my father was. And they're kind of like the middle managers of the Air Force. And then there are the senior officers, and the senior officers would be like the colonels and generals who actually lived in a whole different neighborhood. They had these beautiful brick houses, and they were the people you never wanted to run afoul of because they had a lot of power. And in a hierarchical culture like the military, that power was very much derived from what your rank was. My father, who was a lieutenant and then who was a captain, a young officer, there were many people in the neighborhood whom he outranked. And so if they met him in a social situation, they couldn't just call him by his first name like we would in a normal neighborhood. They had to call him sir, and they would have to call him Captain Jordan or Lieutenant Jordan. And that hierarchy translated not only to his relationships with other people in our neighborhood, but also to my mother's relationships, because she was a military wife, and military wives followed the same hierarchy, and to some extent to us kids as well. Officers tended to live on one side of the neighborhood, enlisted folks tended to live on the other side of the neighborhood. And even that distinction between being an officer or an enlisted person communicated quite a bit about who you are, because officers tended to have a college education, they tended to have a higher pay scale, they tended to usually come from a little bit more of a privileged background, and enlisted folks tended not to have a college education. They tended to have gotten most of their formal training being in the military service. Their pay scale wasn't as high, and they often had a lot of resentment for the officers. So it was a strange dynamic, because there were people in our neighborhood who would treat my father with the utmost respect in person, who probably loathed him at home, and not because of anything about him personally, but just because they didn't like officers. These social dynamics made our neighborhood of identical houses really interesting. And I really took for granted what a unique experience that I was getting at that time, because everything to me seemed so normal. And living on a military base is really weird. It's a really strange experience. For example, every day at 5 o'clock, they would take down the flag. They had a big flag at the front of the base. You couldn't even see it from where we lived because the base was so big, but they had this giant flag, and they would take it down, and they would play the Star-Spangled Banner, which is the American national anthem, over a loudspeaker. And they would play it. You could barely hear it, but if you could hear it, you were supposed to stop and either salute or put your hand over your heart and face towards where the flag was while they were taking it down. And this was serious. I mean, I know this sounds kind of silly, but this was serious. Anytime the flag would even go by, we were supposed to stop and salute or put our hand over our heart and pay attention to it. So they could actually, if you were driving your car and they were taking the flag down and you could hear the strains of the Star-Spangled Banner being played over the base, you were supposed to stop your car and pull over on the side of the road and salute. And they could actually pull you over and give you a ticket if you didn't do that. And likewise, us kids, we were supposed to stop playing at that time of day and turn and salute towards the flag. A very unusual thing that seemed really normal to me at the time. Also, living on base, we had a tremendous sense of freedom, us kids, and we could ride our bikes all over the place. And as long as we weren't going out on the flight lines or in a restricted area, we had pretty much a run of a lot of the base. And this led us to have a lot of culture. We had a lot of places that we had found that we would give names. There was a lot of legends behind places that we would call like the Secret Pond or the Turtle Pond or things like that. There was a big golf course that ran by our neighborhood that we weren't supposed to be on, but which we had all kinds of ways of sneaking into and around, that led to a lot of our cultural mythology. And all of the kids who lived on that base would become a part of this culture, would understand it, would know all of these meanings and all these myths and all of these legends. And if you would move off base, then you would take that with you. And if you would move on to base, you would have to learn and be indoctrinated into that. The only time I ever got a sense of how weird some of this stuff was, how unique it was, how different it was when I went to school. Our school was not on base. It was in the civilian community next to us. And when I say civilian, for those of you that don't know the military world, civilian means that they are not in the military. They don't work on, not only do they not work on base, but really they don't understand the military culture. So we were next to a town where there were a lot of civilians, and these civilians were just normal people. And they would live in the neighborhoods around the schools or, around the town and just live normal lives, or what I would call today a normal life. And interacting with them at school, it was so weird because they didn't understand a lot of what we experienced as military kids. And us military kids would kind of hang together because we understood each other's references, we understood each other's experiences, and our civilian friends really didn't. In a couple of ways that were really distinctly different. One was that military kids really looked forward to having an ID card issued to them. An ID card was something that you got when you were 10 years old, and it allowed you to have access to places on base that you weren't able to get into without your parents if you were under 10. You could go to the movie theater, you could go to the BX, which was kind of like the base Walmart. You could go to the commissary, which was like the base grocery store, all kinds of other places with an ID card. So that was a big deal to us. That was like getting your driver's license, having a military ID card. Another thing that was a really big deal to us was the distinction that when we would go to see extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, we had to travel. That was always a trip. You know, my family actually was from Florida, so we would have to go all the way down to Florida anytime we wanted to see relatives. Civilian families would have all of those people living around them a lot of times. You know, these were people often who were born and bred in the communities that they lived in. And so, you know, again, they didn't understand this whole idea that we would have to travel in order to see family. It was really weird to them. All of these things were points that didn't make a lot of sense to me as a kid, but as I got older, I started to understand how weird and different my lifestyle was. And what happened was when I turned 10 years old, we moved off base. And when we moved off base, I had to quickly readjust to a new life in a new place and understand how different and how weird my upbringing had been. And this later on in life helped me to make a lot more sense out of what ethnography is, because I began to see how just in the role of being this kid, looking at people's identical houses and spotting the differences between them, and then later seeing the differences between my culture and the culture of the civilians outside the base, those are very similar skills to what you would do as an ethnographer. Being an ethnographer is essentially about walking into a situation where you are unfamiliar with the way someone else lives, and you're trying your best to learn about their life and their culture. And again, ethnography comes from ultimately the field of social anthropology, and it's not that different from being a scientist who embeds himself in a tribe of people that are very different and trying to understand how that tribe lives and works. But we use it in the context of marketing research to understand how people live and interact with products and services, and with different categories of things that we can buy and sell. So ethnography as a form of primary marketing research is about embedding yourself in the life of your research subject and learning to see the world through his or her eyes. And when you hear about ethnography, a lot of times you hear about it in really exciting contexts. For example, in this class, I handed out 3 articles that you could read. One about some ethnographers that embedded themselves in the Harley-Davidson culture, and that's a very famous ethnographic piece where they learned all about the world of Harley-Davidson riders, and a lot of their preconceptions about who those people were turned out not to be true. There's also an article about going to Burning Man. Burning Man is a big festival that attracts people who are really artistically minded. And in Burning Man, there's quite a bit of context to learn. And then there's also the context of Turkish women, another article that I handed out, where 2 researchers who actually are Turkish women decided to go and study other Turkish women, but they had to first shed themselves of all of these different prejudices they had, because they were women of privilege and education in a culture where they were trying to study women who might not necessarily have those same opportunities. When we're talking about ethnography, there really are 3 broad areas that intersect with each other that we're going to look at. One of them is observation. So ethnography is sort of a fusion of observational techniques and interviewing techniques. But as you can see in this diagram here, observation is just a piece of something that touches different types of interviews that you can do. So in ethnography, we do observe details. We do pay attention to what's going on. It is like walking into someone's house and looking to see how they've furnished and decorated it. But one thing that you can also combine that observation with is interviewing your research subject. And when you interview your research subject, you can look at things such as their behavior, their values, their culture, their norms, and their beliefs. You can also combine that observation by interviewing their cohorts, so people that know them, that live with them, that work with them, who interact with them, who are similar to them. And that can help you to isolate things like environment or influences, and also give you different perspectives on those cultures or norms or beliefs. And also, just interviews between those two groups, cohorts, and with your subject can help you to have a different perspective on cultures and norms and beliefs. So all of these things kind of intersect to help build a bigger body of knowledge. But the problem with ethnography, more than anything, is that ethnography can generate so much data, such a rich, deep understanding of an individual or a small group of individuals, that it's really hard to scale it. It's really hard to take it beyond that small group and to say anything meaningful about it beyond that small group. So a few principles of ethnography are naturalism, understanding, and discovery. And let me just walk you through these really quickly. So naturalism is about observing research subjects in natural settings where the research process has a minimal effect on how they're behaving. And often this is going to be their homes or their work or someplace where they are comfortable. And the idea of naturalism is that it can really give you different data from research that's being conducted in a more sterile research setting, or some sort of research context that you've set up, or experimental design. If you're talking to people and observing them in their home, you're going to see a whole different side of them than you would see if you had them come into a research facility. They're going to take their guard down after a while, and they're going to show you things about themselves, or they're going to inadvertently give you cues about things, even if they're trying to put on a happy face, that tell you a different story about who they are. Another principle is understanding. Understanding is developing a working knowledge of their culture, their environment, and their interpersonal connections that shape their actions and which may have some causal influence on how they behave. Now, I want to be careful when I say causal influence, that we're going to be making, I would say, very light causal inferences. We can't actually establish cause and effect through ethnography in any way, shape, or form. But what we can do is we can see things that perhaps are suggestive of cause and effect. So, we might notice, for example, that a subject tends to eat out a lot. We're observing them; they tend to eat a lot of fast food, and the cause and effect that we might speculate is it's because of their busy lifestyle. Or we might notice that they tend to make use of Uber quite a lot and not to use their own car. We might speculate it's because they are afraid that their own car is going to break down, and so they make use of Uber even though it's more expensive because it's much more convenient for them and they don't have to worry about a breakdown. So there's other speculations that we can make. Often, even settings that appear to be familiar bring with them complex social influences that must be unraveled. A lot of times when we're observing people in contexts that we think we understand, we find out really quickly that we don't. And this goes back to my discussion of these people with all these identical homes. Even though every single one of us living on that military base had homes with the exact same floor plan, every home was different. And what might have seemed really obvious and familiar was heavily influenced by who the people living in that home were. So there are lots of complex social influences that have to be unraveled a lot of times when we're doing ethnography. Discovery is the other principle. And that comes from approaching research subjects with an exploratory framework and a minimum of hypotheses or assumptions. This prevents researchers from missing important details that may provide explanation for cultural phenomena. And what this basically means is that we want to go into ethnography with an open mind. We want to be able to make connections between contexts, cultures, and other influences during analysis, not prior to it. We don't want to go in with a lot of assumptions about what we're going to see and interpret them through that filter. We want to go in with as open of a mind as possible. Ultimately, ethnography is a fusion of observational research and in-depth interviewing, but it has an entirely different vantage that provides an entirely different perspective. And if you take away anything from this lecture series, I want it to be this, that ethnography is not just a nice, common, easy way to combine two forms of research. It can be used to get an entirely different type of data than those other two types of research, and it's really better used to augment them than it is as a means of trying to replace them. So as we're going to talk about in our next lecture, there are a lot of practices in ethnography. I'm going to be honest with you and tell you there are not a lot of what I would call established best practices. A lot of ethnographers are very individualistic in the way they do things, and while there are certainly accepted practices that primarily come from anthropology and sociology that are used, every ethnographer seems to have a different style. There are different ways of collecting data. There are different ways of organizing and analyzing that data. And in some respects, that makes ethnography a really weak method, because it is so based on interpretation and individual assessment that it doesn't always stand up to a lot of rigor. But when it's used properly and when it's combined with other forms of more rigorous research, it can be very valuable, and it actually can be one of the deepest and most rewarding forms of research that you conduct. So with that said, we'll talk about some methods in the next lecture.